here. I voted early so that I could be here while the chairwoman goes to vote. And I want to say publicly a big thank you to the chairwoman for holding this hearing. I think it's really important. I think it's important that this committee look at the real costs of war, including where the Department of Defense failed to take steps that were necessary to prevent exposing members of the military to toxic chemicals. I know that many of our witnesses on this panel have been fighting for over a decade for DOD and the VA to recognize how burn pit exposure has had devastating effects on service members' lives. Now, I know that there's some debate over the data, but it's just common sense that these toxins would cause significant problems to human beings. And it's important for DOD to continue to study this issue, to improve our understanding of the science, but we can't keep waiting for action. We need to take care of our veterans now, not later, now. I know that the focus of today's hearing is DOD's role in determining eligibility for care, not the VA's, but we also have to consider the toll of this entire process on families. So, Ms. Torres, if you don't mind, I'd like to be able to ask you about your experiences. I read your testimony. I understand about how hard you've had to fight, how long you have had to fight to get the care that your husband deserves and that other veterans deserve. So if I can, let me just ask you a little bit about how this process makes your family feel.
Thank you so much for that question. It's been a journey, a hellish journey of delay and deny, not just for myself, the Torres family, but for thousands, possibly millions of families. It feels, I know for my husband, being stripped of his integrity and dignity, losing his job, being on the brink of foreclosure, repossession of cars, and you ask yourself, how did we get here? Mm-hmm. And how is this happening in America's backyard? It feels as if the nation has turned its back when you're, attempting to just access care. We attempted to access care from both DOD and VA healthcare institutions, and throughout those 10 years, it was always an excuse of there's no science, there's no proof. And so myself, including, I know many families, maybe to include yours, Tom, is that we have to exhaust our life savings just to access doctors like Dr. Anthony Zema, like Dr. Robert Miller, like the doctors over at National Jewish, being away from our children. That's time lost that I'll never get back. And so not only, does it impact the veteran and the spouse, but the children. And so, to still, to this day, to finally see some momentum as we're seeing now, it really gives us hope.
Well, I'm glad to hear you in that on hope. But when you say you feel as if our government, our country, has turned its back on you and your family and thousands, maybe millions of families in the same position, no veteran should feel that way. And no family of a veteran should feel that way. You have done a tremendous amount of advocacy related to changing the rules for how veterans must prove they were impacted by burn pits in order to get care. I support you in your work on this. I know it is a hard and lonely journey, but you have done remarkable work here. So let me see if I can turn this around just a little bit. Ms. Torres, what would it mean to you and other veterans' families if the rules were changed so that the DOD and the VA believed veterans when they said their health was harmed by burn pits, rather than making them jump through so many hoops?
Well, it would remove the burden of proof of us having to be our own lawyers, our own researchers, our own all of those things that we've become, right? We've sort of, mobilized and congregated online, all sharing that common denominator of delay and deny. So to finally see, historic legislation passed so that we don't have to be all those things, so that the Gold Star spouses that call us weekly expressing how heart-wrenching it is for them to spend the last moments of their loved one's life gathering buddy statements and evidence when they should be holding the hand and embracing their loved one. It would mean everything to us and to those families that are still struggling to this day, and for those still waiting on an answer from the VA.
Well, as I said, I commend you for your advocacy work here. It at least helps us start to move in the right direction. And I appreciate that making a change like this is not inexpensive. There's a lot of money at stake here. And I also understand it is not all in the jurisdiction of this committee. But it is urgent that we treat families, we treat those who are injured without delay. We cannot allow veterans to wait another minute for health care. And so I hope that the work we do here today will help put more momentum behind change. This committee regularly advocates for spending on weapons that don't work or weapons that are not needed at all. It is inexcusable to claim that we need to balance the budget on the backs of veterans and their families who've been injured. So I hope that what comes out of our work today is that we can give a stronger push on that. If I can, I've got a few more questions here, questions that the chair also wanted me to ask. Mr. Patterson, if I could ask you about the advances in technology that have been made and can be made to improve the way that troops' toxic exposure can be documented. Could you say a bit about that, please?
Well, thank you, Senator. As far as advances since Desert Storm, sadly, it's not been very significant. We replaced the mini-vol with a different type of deployable particulate matter sampler, but there's still significant challenges. Those samplers simply capture the particulate matter that's in the air, and then you can send it to a lab, and many months later, get a report back of what was possibly in that sample. The downside of that is any volatile organic compounds are not going to be in that sample because they will have cooked off in the transportation and those months for you to get the sample back. So the progress has been extremely slow and extremely challenging. And I'm just looking at my time in from Desert Storm to Afghanistan. I made some recommendations in my testimony. I believe that the biomarkers have some significant capabilities with them. The silicone bracelets, I think, is an excellent idea because then we would be able to know much sooner. For instance, Afghanistan, we had formaldehyde-treated lumber from China that we were using to build the small buildings that the soldiers slept in. I had no reason to expect to find formaldehyde in a pristine river valley in Afghanistan. Why is that there? I have no reason to go look for that. If we had had those silicone bracelets on those individuals, we could have had them back. And there's time to this, but I would have known quickly rather than a year or two later, hey, why, what is this? And then we could have mitigated it, and I could have protected the next group of soldiers that went in there. Mm-hmm. So, and the remote sensing that I mentioned, I believe is very key moving forward when we get to, if we're going to do dispersed operations with small groups. There's a lot of atmospheric analysis that can be done with satellite imagery. It's a bit of an immature space, but if you're talking special operations units that are very small, they're never going to have a preventive medicine person visit them. So that would give you some idea. And I believe the problem with all of these things is they're not perfect, but they will further the science significantly. And we've been pushing too much for perfect rather than taking some reasonable steps forward.
And just so I can get the comparison here, can you say a little bit about when you were in Afghanistan in 2008 and 2009, how was an individual's exposure to a burn pit measured or documented?
Well, Senator, some of them were not documented at all, which is a very frustrating point for me, because we were operating down in the small FOBs where it might have been a platoon on a FOB, so 50 people, maybe 100 individuals. And with a staff of approximately 20 people, there was no way that I could get them out there to do that surveillance, which should have been done weekly. Ideally, you want to do it once a week, rotating, so you never repeat it on the same weekday. So some of those FOBs, I would grab a soil sample because that was all that I could do. Those air monitors take 24 hours to capture a sample properly. If you just go and take a grab, it could be very high or very low. You need the average over 24 hours. So a lot of them, there's probably little to no data in the DOORS system, which was mentioned earlier, to be able to address that soldier's concerns. The larger compounds fared better, but even then, I cannot tell you what I was exposed to in those 13 months, and this was my job. So for an individual who is ignorant of the space and thinks they're invulnerable at 20-something, they're not going to have any idea.
So let me just ask the follow-on question to that. When service members are headed home, what kind of information were they given about their exposure and what kind of risks they might be facing in the future?
It was all self-reporting that I recall.
Okay.
Sometimes some units would put something in their medical record that said you had a burn pit exposure or you had a heavy metal exposure from the location that you were in. But that was a unit by unit situation. And then, as mentioned earlier, they asked this 20-year-old invincible individual, what were you exposed to? I'm fine. I don't have any problems. And they move out. Another concern is then those individuals that never end up going to the VA at all. You did your tour. You were 22 years old and bulletproof, and they never went into the VA system. Then they approached the VA 10 or 20 years later. Now they have that much of a tougher upstream fight. And the FOB, the compound names changed constantly. There's some individuals that probably, that compound no longer existed 5 years later. Quite often they changed every year. The gentleman talking about being able to link this to an individual's exposure, unless the personnel operating system is changed, that unit identification code links everybody to usually the company level. But if that company operated 3 sites with their platoons broken out to those other sites, that data is not accurate for that individual. So there's going to be a lot of challenges, and the further we go back, the more challenges there are going to be with linking people to location to exposure.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much,
Thank you,
Mr.
Senator.
Patterson. I'm going to yield back to the chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for your testimony today. I think you have really informed the committee what we have to accomplish. I particularly appreciated the specific requests that you've made of this committee, specific changes